Good evening and a very warm welcome to St John's College and to this year's Sidney Ball lecture. I'm Sue Black and I have the honour of being the 37th President of St John's College. We are very proud to be associated with this lecture, as Sidney Ball was a prominent figure at St John's in modern history as a socialist thinker and an educational reformer. Born in Perthshire, in Worcestershire, in 1857, he graduated from Oriel College reading classics. He joined St John's as a fellow in philosophy in 1882, and 3 years later he became our senior tutor. I am reliably informed that he also applied to be president in 1909, but he was deemed to be too progressive for the time. I'm not sure what that says about the presidents at St John's. In 1883, he was one of the founders of the Toynbee Hall, and in 1895, he became a founding member of the Oxford University Fabian Society, an offshoot from the Fabian Society, which is Britain's oldest political think tank. In 1916, he became an architect of the D.Phil degree, and his thinking was influential in the introduction of the PPE degree. He campaigned for the admission of women to full membership of the university and the abolition of compulsory chapel. Maybe now we're starting to see his progressive thinking. When Ball died in 1918, the Barnet House Committee renamed their annual lecture in his honour, and he was their first chairman. The event brings distinguished speakers to Oxford each autumn to discuss key themes in social policy and intervention. Ball strongly believed that places of learning should be open to all, and I do hope that he would have approved of the modern St John's with its focus firmly set on quality, equality, diversity, and wider access opportunities. So welcome to St John's, and it's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Nelson, who will introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you.
But before I do that, I wish to wish you all a very warm welcome to this 117th Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture. So I'm Kenneth Nelson. I'm Barnet Professor of Social Policy and Deputy Head of the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, or DSPI as we usually are called. And it's a great pleasure for us at DSPI to be part of the organizing team for this lecture this year again. I would like to start also by expressing our deep gratitude to Professor Dame Sue Black and to St. John's College for hosting us in this lovely lecture hall, and for the food and drinks that we will receive after, of course. I would also like to thank Amanda, Kylie, and Simon, as well as the Connected Communications team at DSPI for a fantastic job of organizing and promoting this event. And before I really introduce this year's speaker, I want to say something briefly about this lecture series and also something about DSPI. So the first lecture in this series was given over 100 years ago in 1917. Just a few years after the Barnet House was established in 1914. And at the time, the Barnet House was set up as a center of excellence for the study of contemporary social and economic problems, and for training young people in social work and research. Over the years, the Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture have hosted some very, very prominent scholars and luminaries. Among the very early scholars, we find John Keynes, Sidney Webb, Richard Toney, Sir William Beveridge, and Richard Titmuss, for example. And I really wish we had some video recordings of those talks. Unfortunately, we don't. So DSPI originates from Barnet House, which was formally incorporated into Oxford University in 1961. So at DSPI, we not only continue the tradition of the Barnet House in improving our understanding of various social problems that we observe in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and in the world, but we are also interested in finding evidence-based ways to solve these problems. We very much believe that the research that we do at the SPI and the teaching that we provide continue to make a significant difference to the lives of people around the globe. So much of the research that is carried out at the SPI is based on international comparisons. And it is also for her contribution to comparative social policy that our speaker today, Professor Silja Häusermann, is best known, at least to me. Silja is Professor of Swiss Politics and Comparative Political Economy at the Institute for Political Science at the University of Zurich, and where she is also head of the department. Professor Häusermann has also been visiting scholar in the Department of Government at Harvard University, and she also been a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. I have followed Professor Häusermann's work for several years, and it is with great enthusiasm and admiration that I have seen her emerge as one of the most prominent scholars in our field. Professor Häusermann has published widely in areas of comparative politics, comparative political economy. Among other things, her work has helped us to understand how socioeconomic and electoral changes affect the distributive processes of the welfare state, particularly but not exclusively in continental Europe. Personally, I have very much enjoyed your research on labor market dualization and its impacts on various groups of workers in contemporary welfare states. So Silja, thank you very much for joining us today. And we are very much looking forward to your lecture on political conflicts and of public welfare provision. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a real pleasure and a true honor to be invited to give this lecture tonight. I also would like to thank my hosts, the organizing team, and of course you all for coming and listening to this lecture. I see a few familiar faces and many people I haven't met yet, but I look forward to speaking to many of you tonight. It is a particular honor also to speak in the memory of Sidney Ball. I have read up on his work and legacy, and I was very impressed, of course, about how creatively and forcefully he advocated ideas about how to adapt institutions to changing society. And this is also the topic that I will speak about tonight when I talk about the politics of welfare reform in the 21st century Western Europe. And I will argue that the question of inclusion versus segmentation, and I will explain what I mean by that, has become one of the key questions to be answered in this process of adapting welfare states to the current challenges. I have kindly been invited here to present some ideas and findings from an ongoing project which builds on an ERC project that has been running for 5 years in Zurich. So this, what I present here is also collaborative work from this team. Next to me it is Macarena Ares, Matthias Enkist and Michael Pinquera who have collaborated with me on that project. And the work is also coming together as a book. It's slightly overdue with Oxford University Press, so I feel under pressure to bring this to a conclusion, but I feel quite confident that next year will be the year where this book comes out. So I'm happy to present some of the key ideas here to you. I will start the talk by spending quite a bit of time on the motivation and the basic idea that underlines the thesis that I would like to present tonight. Especially elaborating on the changed context that I think is important for the welfare state choices and reform opportunities that we discuss today in Western Europe. I will then explain the theoretical framework and how we try to study and implement it empirically before giving some insights into a few empirical chapters and analysis from the book. in this case dealing with responses to the challenges of immigration on the one hand and the emergence of the knowledge economy on the other hand, before concluding with some broader implications. So the key question at the origin of the project that I present here is the question: what are the welfare state reform opportunities in response to three key challenges to the welfare state in our times? And by reform opportunities, I mean the direction in which, the substantive direction in which these reforms can go, and the political likelihood for them to succeed. We focus on three key challenges. There are more challenges to welfare states nowadays, but the three we focus on are the emergence of the knowledge economy on the one hand, meaning strong and profound occupational change in all countries of Western Europe towards an expansion of middle and high-skilled occupation. And for welfare states, this presents the challenge of securing both work, participation in the workforce, and also income security in labor markets that are increasingly skill and education biased. On the other hand, we have the demographic challenge. That's not a very new one. It's a one that we have been talking about for a long time, but it is still a key challenge to welfare states. And here the challenge is to provide decent old age pensions and security for people who work in these changing labor markets. So in labor markets where work biographies are more and more discontinuous and non-linear. And finally, the final challenge we focus on is the massive politicization of migration in Western European countries over the past about 2 decades, I would say. This is mostly a political challenge to the welfare state, and the challenge here is to sustain social inclusion and solidarity in the light of this challenge. And so the idea is that the answers that need to be given to these 3 challenges need to be found in a context, in a political and social context that has changed quite a bit compared to the context of the emergence of the European welfare states. And to theorize what these changes are, what is different in the current context, I rely a lot on an article by Peter Hall, where he quite brilliantly, as I think, distinguishes 3 eras or 3 periods of changing relationships between markets and the state. I won't go into detail on the first 2. The era of modernization he calls kind of the post-war era, with the emergence of mainstream parties, time of economic growth, emergence of welfare state, followed by an era of liberalization with a lot of ideational changes, starting weakening of mainstream parties and also increasing fiscal constraints. And then from about 2000 onwards, Peter Hall speaks of the era of knowledge-based growth. And this is a time where, again, the state takes primacy over markets, but in different ways, as in the post-war era, and through different actors. There are many things that are new in this era of knowledge-based growth, but I want to focus on 2 aspects that I think are relevant for the challenges to welfare state and the answers that can be found to these challenges to providing social security in the current times. One challenge is a persistent strong demand for welfare, for social policy. I'll show you some numbers on that in a second. But in a context of either real or perceived fiscal constraint. So there is a strong constraint, at the same time a strong demand, and that, I will argue, brings the question of priorities and relative importance that people give to different types of social policy to the forefront. And the other context change that I want to address more in detail is a political one. The transformation of electoral politics over the past 20 years in Western Europe by what we call in political science the polarisation of so-called second dimension politics. And I'll explain in a second what I mean by that. So let's first look at this first point, strong demand for welfare in the context of fiscal constraint. So the numbers I show you here are from our welfare priorities ERC project. These are survey data from 8 West European countries, the UK, Ireland, Denmark, then Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain and Italy. They are pooled here. I will show you pooled analysis tonight. But what we see here is support for expanding social policies. So we asked about different fields of social policy, whether people think that the government should increase or expand unemployment insurance, old age pensions, health coverage, etc. And we just pooled it here and aggregated it. And what I want to show you is that across the ideological spectrum of respondents, so from far left to far right, we have a clear majority, even in some instances up to 75% and more of respondents who agree or even strongly agree with the statement that social policy should be increased or expanded. At the same time, and here's the interesting complement to these attitudes, when we ask people about fiscal constraint perceptions, or when we ask to what extent they agree with the statement that taxes are already high and that the government cannot levy more money from citizens via taxes anymore, we also find a clear large majority of people who agree with this statement, even on the left of the political spectrum. So here to the left are people who self-identify very much to the left, and even there we have 2/3 or more of the respondents who agree that there are clear limits. And we have asked these questions in various ways, about taxes here, about whether people think that there are limits to a welfare state expansion, etc. And across the board, of course, it's not the same on the left and on the right, but across the board you find a very large majority of people who perceive tight fiscal constraints. And so in combination, we argue that puts the question of priorities on the table. So you want expansion, but you can't have everything. Where do you want to set priorities? And that's why we think that when we study welfare state reform in the 21st century, this question of importance is very important to address. And when we theorize how people and parties, voters and political parties think about these choices of what is a priority, what is more and less important, what will be important to understand is through which lens they think about these questions. So we argue that when you think about what topics are most important, what problems are most important to solve for politics, this is very much structured by general dimensions of conflict, of distributive conflict in society. And here, that's where the emergence of the second dimension, politics, as a dominant lens of thinking about political choice in the 21st century comes in. So this will be familiar to all political scientists in the room, but over the past 20 or 30 years, a huge literature in political science has studied and documented the emergence of a second key dimension of political competition in Western Europe, besides the traditional conflict between economic left and economic right-wing positions, between what we call universalism or integration and particularism or demarcation. And this is a conflict that is very strong in the electoral arena, so it's something that really drives party competition and voting behavior. This conflict is most salient around questions of immigration, international integration, cultural liberalism, minority rights, gender equality, etc. So not primarily around social policy issues in the narrow sense, but it has become a very prominent lens through which voters and parties think about politics in Western Europe. And the clearest or most obvious manifestation of that is, of course, the emergence of green and far-left parties on the one hand and far-right parties on the other hand in most West European countries over the past 20 years. So here on this slide you see continental European countries on the left-hand side, Nordic European countries on the right-hand side. In majoritarian Anglo-Saxon countries, of course, this development looks a bit different because of the electoral system. There, these tendencies emerge within the large parties mostly, but in the proportional representation countries of Western Europe, we see across the board a weakening of mainstream moderate parties and a massive increase in the vote share of new parties, challenger parties, green and far left on the one hand and far right on the other hand. And they are, of course, the expression of this second dimension politics. We can also represent that in this, see that in this slide here, which presents, in this graph, you see the alignment of all parties in Western European countries along on, again, this economic dimension horizontally and the universalism, particularism dimension vertically. In green, you see green parties. It's not very nicely colored here, but the red dots are socialist parties, the blue dots are liberal parties, conservative parties, and far-right parties. And this divide between what we call the new left, green parties, some of the socialist parties, social democratic parties, as opposed to the far right, has become a key divide. We can show that, and that's quite impressive and important, I think, for welfare state politics, is that by now, people's self-identification as left or right, what they position themselves, correlates more closely with this universalism, particularism position than with the economic left-right. So this is what we did in this graph here. We basically correlate the left-right self-identification with attitudes on these two dimensions. The cultural stands for the socio-cultural universalism, particularism dimension, and the economic for the traditional left-right. And you see that, of course, both of them contribute to the understanding of what is left and right, but the gradient is even stronger with the cultural dimension. And interestingly, when we differentiate between respondents over and under 40, that's where we see the main change. So voters below the age of 40, this is again pooled across all the 8 countries. Respondents under the age of 40, there the link between what they think about themselves as left or right and what they understand by left or right is more closely connected to these ideas of universalism, particularism than to state market. Whereas with the older respondents, both considerations play an equally strong role. However, the fact that these cultural issues or universalism, particularism dimension is important to people doesn't mean that they don't care about social policy anymore, that they only care about immigration and minority rights, etc. So if we ask people how important the topic of social policy is to them, we still find, again, across the board, a clear majority of people who say that it's important or very important to them. So if I summarize what I think is important to the context of welfare state reform in the early 21st century, I want to highlight 2 things. First, there is still a strong demand for welfare state expansion, but at the same time, widespread perception of tight fiscal constraints, which emphasizes the importance of prioritizing some needs over other needs. And at the same time, we see an increasing importance of sociocultural considerations for voters' attitudes and behavior, while they still care a lot about social policy, which by implication means that sociocultural considerations increasingly shape social policy priorities as well. And that leads me to the key contention of the book and of the talk that I want to present tonight. The key contention is that second dimension politics have become an integral part of welfare state politics in the 21st century, and they manifest in terms of inclusive versus segmenting policy preferences. And I want to explain what I mean by that. Inclusive welfare or social policy preferences, which relate to universalistic positions, entail the idea that the welfare state needs to adapt to the structural challenges that we see in today's societies, immigration, international integration, etc., increasing inclusion, diversity. So the social policy needs to help people to adapt to the structural transformation of societies, and should extend protection and solidarity to an ever-increasing number of risk groups and new risk groups. On the other hand, a segmenting answer to these challenges would argue that social policy needs to protect people from the structural challenges. So shield them from the challenges that come with the far-reaching economic and social challenges that our societies confront, and should protect people from them, and also try to maintain and preserve the status quo of existing social policy rights. And if you interpret this dimension of conflict with regard to social policy and then add it to the, of course, still important economic dimension of strong state intervention versus market liberal positions, you end up with basically 4 directions in which welfare states can adapt to respond to these challenges that I mentioned. They can adapt in an inclusive direction on the top left and right, either solidaristic inclusion, what we call solidaristic inclusion, expansion of the welfare state to increasingly plural risk profiles, or targeted inclusion by tailored support for new risk groups and new risk profiles. Or they can answer in a segmenting direction by protecting existing beneficiaries of the welfare state through stratified or differentiated social protection, or then what we call residual segmentation, a minimal social protection standard. And from this, we then develop for the different countries and the different challenges, we develop hypotheses regarding the degree of polarization in reform politics that we expect, and also the main dimension of conflict, either the vertical, the horizontal, or both, between left and right parties, but also within left and right party blocks. And we have hypotheses as well on cross-national variance according to different institutional regimes, but I will not talk about that a lot in this lecture, but I'm happy to go into it later. Let me briefly say how we think the 3 fields that we focus on differ, and why we have different expectations and hypotheses when it comes to the demographic challenge that we study through pension reform, the immigration challenge, and the knowledge economy challenge. We argue that these 3 challenges differ in the main type of pressure that they are exposed to. In the case of pension reform and the knowledge economy, the reform pressure is very strong on the structural side. These are really deeply transforming social challenges that require massive investments also in social policy. The immigration challenge, on the other hand, is, if you look at the numbers, the actual cost of extending social policy to migrants is, in comparison to pensions or labor market and education expenditures, relatively minor. The main pressure is very strong, but it is mainly a political pressure that comes to the welfare state on the topic of immigration. So for pension reform, we have the combination of, on the one hand, a strong mass politicization. It's a topic that people feel strongly about. Parties talk about a lot. It's a lot in the public domain, as well as a strong structural reform pressure. For immigration, it is mostly a political pressure, and for the knowledge economy expansion, adaptation of education systems or vocational training, unemployment insurance, active labor market policies, etc., it's mostly a strong structural reform pressure, but it's less strongly politicized in the electoral arena. And we can show that with data in the book as well. So that implies that we expect different divides, different coalitions, and also different actors to be relevant. But let me give you some more concrete evidence here how we deal with this empirically. So we argue that to study the welfare politics, as I set up the analytical framework here, we need information on how voters and parties take positions on different social policy fields, and we also need data on priorities, on how important these fields are vis-à-vis others. We collect this data in two ways. When it comes to voters, we rely on public opinion surveys. In these 8 countries, we have done 2 large rounds of surveys that we use for this analysis. And when it comes to party positions, we rely on electoral election manifestos. There is some data in the manifesto project database, but we recoded a lot of the manifestos to get at these more fine-grained distinctions of importance and social policy fields in all these countries. So first, I want to give you some evidence on this challenge of immigration, how this leads to a changed political landscape and potential reform coalitions. The politicization of immigration is one of the key challenges to welfare states in the 21st century because it is one of the key distinctive appeals of radical right parties or far-right parties. They have a clear position on this topic, whereas on many other economic and social policy issues, they don't have very clear positions. It is also a topic that has the potential, at least, and we'll see some evidence on that, to divide the left. There is a lot of literature on the so-called progressive dilemma, that the left may be torn or internally divided on whether they prioritize national solidarity and cohesion over inclusion of immigrants or the other way around. And finally, it is a topic that has high saliency in party manifestos. Matthias Enkist, in his dissertation, for instance, was able to show that parties talk almost as much about immigration and social policy in their manifestos as they talk about pensions and social policy in their manifestos, even though, of course, when you look at the numbers, they are very different in size. So then we theorize these 4 directions in which welfare states can be adapted to cope with this challenge of immigrants and immigration's social policy rights. And in terms of solidaristic inclusion, of course, this would mean that people are included in the same pool of solidarity. Can also be targeted inclusions, so that social policies develop very specific programs. They are not included in the same pool of solidarity, but specific programs. Then on the bottom left, we have what we would call welfare chauvinism, the protection or expansion of social policy rights only for natives. And on the bottom right, we have even targeted retrenchment of immigrants' rights, what we call welfare exclusionism. We then, based on what we know about the preferences of voters, develop hypotheses on where we think, according to the literature, different voters and parties might stand in this space of reform opportunities. And these are the hypotheses. So we hypothesize that both left-wing parties, Green Social Democratic Radical Left parties, as well as right-wing parties may be divided on the issue of how to respond to immigration across these different options. We test that by measuring positions, and there's a lot of text on this slide, but I want to give you the intuition. We measure for voters and also for parties the position that they have on both of these dimensions, and then also we weight that by the importance they attribute to it. So that means an actor that is very much at the top of the graph means advocates inclusion, but also attributes a high weight to inclusion of immigrants to social policy. We do that on the inclusion segmentation divide, and we also do it on the etatism market liberalism divide. I can go more into detail with this, but I just wanted to give you the intuition. We do this with survey data for the voters. So we have the position on how they think about the expansion or retrenchment of rights for natives and immigrants and the relative importance. And for parties, for instance, we measure the share of pro-inclusion sentences, of including immigrants in existing welfare schemes, weighted by the saliency that this topic has in the election manifesto. And that allows us to position voters and parties in the political space. And this is what I'm going to show you here. This is the voter graph. So again, pooled across our countries. I can talk about the individual countries in the Q&A. What we see and what conforms to our expectations is that we see a clear divide on the horizontal axis between green voters at the top and radical right voters at the bottom of this divide. And we also see that the inclusion segmentation divide is clearly stronger and more polarized than the etatism market liberalism divide on this topic. What we also see, and it goes against the hypothesis that we derived from the literature, is that actually left-wing voters, green, social democratic and radical left voters, are not so divided on the inclusion segmentation divide. We see a relatively cohesive position in the inclusion camp. This looks similar when it comes to political parties, even more extreme, I would say. This is political parties based on manifestos. And here we also see a relatively cohesive left, especially the radical left in Western Europe is clearly pro-inclusion of immigrants and not segmentalist when it comes to immigrants' welfare rights in their manifestos. And on the other hand, the radical right, of course, which has a very different position. So on immigration, our main findings in the book is that inclusion segmentation is very polarized, is very salient in all the countries that we study, that the right is more strongly divided on this issue than the left across the countries that we look at. Ireland is a little different. But apart from that, we find a much more cohesive left than right. And we find overall, when we look at the type of coalitions that are most likely to emerge based on the preferences of voters and parties, and also here we have more specific data than on what kind of policies they would support, we find most strongly coalition potentials for targeted inclusion. So we find more support for inclusion than for welfare chauvinism, for instance, but we find mostly support for targeted inclusion or potentials, I would say, for coalitions between the left and liberal parties for targeted inclusion. But you could say, of course, when it comes to immigration, you find this universalism, particularism, you find this inclusion, segmentation divide. That's the prototypical case where you would expect these questions of inclusion or segmentation to matter. So I want to also give you a glimpse into the knowledge economy chapter of the book or analysis, where it is about labor markets, education systems, childcare, everything that relates around the workforce in an increasingly skill-biased labor market, where the question of inclusion segmentation is maybe less obvious than it is when it comes to immigration. But it's still clearly one of the structural key challenges to the welfare state in the 21st century, because we see this massive amount of skill-biased occupational expansion, because we see an increasing concentration of employment risks, both for precarious employment and also unemployment among the less skilled, and also because, of course, these trends go together with increasing income inequality. So the question how to handle this challenge is obviously a very important one for West European welfare states. Here too, we can think about the possible directions in which to take welfare states in four different ways that we theorize as follows. Solidaristic inclusion in this context would mean what we call inclusive social investment. Social investment being social policy instrument that allow people to participate in the labor market. So here the entire idea of inclusion when it comes to the knowledge economy would be, how do we support people to adapt to the changes that we see ongoing in society and labor markets, and how do we enable and allow them to participate in these changed labor markets. And this can be done in an inclusive way. Inclusive social investment means these are policies that are really universal, deliberately try to include both lower income, lower skilled social groups, but also the middle class, and thereby tend to be much more generous than if they are only targeted. On the other hand, we can have targeted or stratifying social investment that really provides these inclusive dynamics only for certain groups. And then on the other hand, we have on the more generous etatist side protection with compensatory social insurance benefits on the one hand, and with residual segmentation, some minimal protection, mostly of labor market insiders or existing beneficiaries of labor market integration. Again, we develop hypotheses on where we expect parties and voters to stand based on what we know about their needs and about their socio-structural profile and their social policy preferences. And here we actually assume a lower level of polarization because the issue is much less polarized in the electoral debate, but we do expect radical right parties to take a more segmentalist position because they have more in their electorate, they mostly represent labor market insiders from the lower middle class or lower classes that try to protect, so to speak, the existing status quo. But we expect lower levels of polarization overall among the other parties. Again, we operationalize and measure these positions with a similar type of measures. We measured positions of voters and weight them by the relative importance they give to these policies, and the same for parties. Here, it is clearly about social investment policies. So we look at support for higher education, for active labor market policies, for childcare policies, and then the relative importance given to these policies. And when it comes to parties, the same. And on the etatism, market liberalism position, we look at much more general support for expansive or more restrictive social policy. And when we look again at the distribution of voters in the political space, we see indeed less of a polarized picture than when it comes to immigration. So we see that on both dimensions, etatism, liberalism, and segmentation inclusion, we see a certain divide, but less extreme than in the immigration case. And we do see again, the radical right as the party family that has the most pronounced segmentation position. Among parties, this is more extreme or more radical, also because the adaptation to the knowledge economy is less polarized in the electorate and is more of an elite policy to a large extent. Here again, with our conformist with our hypothesis is the segmentalist position of the radical right. What is interesting is that in our data, the social democratic parties in the countries we looked at are clearly at the inclusive end of the positions. We expected them to be more moderate here. But overall, we see relatively little polarization among the parties except for the radical right. So here we find a continuing also etatism market liberalism divide on issues of social policy responses. We find divides especially among the right again. So this is a finding that we find across the book, also then when it comes to pension, increasing divide within the right field. And I think our literature, social policy literature or welfare state literature has focused a lot on left parties and left party divides, etc. But actually what we were most intrigued by when looking at our findings were massive divides we find within the right, between liberal right parties, conservative parties, and far right parties over this dimension of inclusion and segmentation, making in many cases moderate right parties pivotal actors for coalitions for social policy reforms. And finally, we find coalition potential that differ a bit across the different countries that we look at. We find mostly potentials for solidaristic or targeted inclusion in continental and Nordic countries, but stronger potentials for these coalitions for segmentation in Southern Europe. And this difference is mostly due to the fact that the different both electorates but also parties have different sizes and weights in the different regions. So in Southern Europe, for instance, the voters, the typical voters of that prefer segmentalist policies are much more numerous than in continental and Nordic countries, and so we see a stronger potential for these coalitions in these countries. So I want to conclude this lecture by saying a few things about what we hope to contribute to different strands of the literature with this very broad presentation and analysis. In the book, of course, we go into much more detail for specific countries, specific reform fields, but for this lecture I thought I want to give you the general idea of what we are after. But more to conclude here, the contributions to different strands of the literature. For social policy research, I think it's important to really pay attention to this inclusion, segmentation, divide. And I think in a lot of the social policy literature, this is still very much confined to questions of welfare chauvinism or integration of immigrants to social policy, which is, of course, has become a strong and large and important literature. But I think the effect of the politicization of these questions of inclusion and segmentation goes far beyond the area of immigration and social policy, and actually affects social policy reform across all social policy fields. Even when it comes to pension reforms, we find clear differences within the right bloc and also, in that case, also within the left bloc. To the literature on party politics in Europe, the message is a little bit different. Party politics in Europe has so far studied the second dimension politics mostly with regard to international integration policies, immigration policies, but has so far quite neglected, I would say, social and economic policies, because in this literature on the transformation of party politics in Europe, the idea is that social policy is a matter of the first dimension of conflict between etatism and market liberalism. And so when you study the socio-cultural divide, you don't need to address questions of welfare reform or social policy that much. And we think that is wrong, especially because especially on these issues of social policy, we have a strongly divided right. And that, of course, changes the entire dynamic of the party systems. And finally, a point that I think is important when you think about these reform opportunities in such a multidimensional way, I think you become aware of the importance of political agency and also of the fact that different coalitional dynamics can happen. So we are very far away from an endogenous institutionalist argument here, that the path that a welfare state take over time is very much predetermined by past institutions. Here we think in a multidimensional space where different coalitions can form and where different reform directions are possible. And I think that puts the politics and the importance of political agency at the center of the analysis. And with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.